Madeleine Albright, the first female U.S. Secretary of State, has died at the age of 84.
During the Clinton administration, Albright served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations before becoming the nation's top diplomat. She championed the expansion of NATO and military intervention in the Balkans to stop genocide. Former President Barack Obama awarded Albright the Medal of Freedom in 2012.
For more on this, let's bring in CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Joel Payne. Hi, Joel. So tell us a little bit more about Madeleine Albright's childhood experiences and how those experiences when she was escaping then Czechoslovakia during the Nazi invasion and then growing up in the communist Yugoslavia shaped her worldviews as a diplomat.
Well, I think the way you lay that out is right. It was definitive to who she was as a person, but also how she showed up in the diplomatic arena. One of the things she's most known for is defining this principle of assertive multilateralism. Really, that's about kind of preventative diplomacy, about organizing other nations and others in the international community to help prevent a situation from spiraling, probably a situation like one we're dealing with in Ukraine right now. I think she would have been a big proponent of the type of preventative diplomacy that would allow that to get to a point. And I think Secretary Albright really built her career around those lessons that she learned from her childhood that you referred to. She's somewhat of the last of a bygone era of these singular figures, the Warren Christophers, the Colin Powells, who we, of course, eulogized a few months ago. Folks like that who had these larger-than-life presences and had these, core principles that they brought to the job based on life experience and based on real strong POVs. And look, they will certainly be missed. Secretary Albright had a long and distinguished life of public service, and her post-public service career was impressive as well. So she certainly leaves a giant legacy.
Joel, always interesting when we're talking about pioneers to talk about background and qualifications. So can you give us a sense of what it was in Madeleine Albright's background that led her to become an ambassador to the UN and then, of course, the first female Secretary of State?
Well, let's talk a little bit. Let's dig a little deeper about the way you introduced the topic here. She was born to a family that was fleeing, the Nazi advances in Central Europe, and I think that legacy of diplomacy that she carried through her entire career that was really established there, right? When you think about the importance of talking to both friends and allies in the international space and making sure that, particularly in her role as the chief diplomat for the United States, that the U.S. always showed up around the world to be the kind of moral arbiters of what's right and what's wrong, not being empty, not leaving an empty space in that international community. I think Secretary Albright certainly did that. She devoted her career to that. And, again, that era of diplomats that she comes from, this was the way that they did it. I mean, I tell you, a lot of Americans probably wouldn't even know her political background. Of course, she was someone who worked in a number of Democratic administrations. She was on the National Security Council for President Jimmy Carter. She obviously worked for President Bill Clinton. But that era of diplomat, the Warren Christophers, the Colin Powells, you even go back a couple of years before that, the George Shultzes, the Jim Bakers, those are folks that were so larger than life that you almost kind of forgot their partisan identification because the world was so different and the job of Secretary of State was different, and it certainly evolved in the last quarter century. I think she was on the cutting edge of defining what that modern diplomat role would and should be.
And, she's recently been once again sort of in the public eye with this op-ed that she wrote in the New York Times criticizing very strongly Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It certainly is part of her larger worldview. I mean, she never stopped being concerned with the direction the world is going. Apparently, she, of course, will be largely remembered for supporting the expansion of NATO and pushing for the alliance to stop genocide and ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. Joel, can you discuss the significance of her involvement in those actions, and why do you think they have become so intertwined with her legacy?
Well, that current event with obviously with the terrible war that Vladimir Putin has wrought on Ukraine. We know from her public comments that Secretary Albright believed that the U.S. was, an indispensable nation to defending democracy around the globe. And of course, you're looking at, Vladimir Putin, kind of the embodiment of this autocratic menace on the other side of the world. And I think she saw the U.S. and U.S. Foreign diplomacy as being a force for good. She saw herself in that role as being someone who could advance that. This is someone who probably you can't tell the story. I like to think about individuals like Secretary Albright. You really can't tell the story of the world and of the United States in the past half century without Madeleine Albright. And I think even coming up to now in her last days with this most recent international situation we're in Ukraine, it probably reminded her of so many other of these international crises that she lorded over during her time in the public discourse, and I'm sure that some of the core tenets that she held true. I'm sure they probably still were very resonant to her in her last days.
It's such an interesting thing to consider a life and a career, of course, as we were just talking about with this notion of her as a pioneer. I'm just wondering, this sort of iron fist, velvet glove dichotomy. She had both. She had the iron fist, did she not? And she also had the velvet glove. Well,
look, anyone who is as successful and has been in the public eye as long as Secretary Albright, I'm sure, is not to be trifled with. But I do think it's interesting, and I bet you some of her scholarship would point to the double standard that a lot of women probably felt, especially from her era, that they were stereotyped to be a certain way, to present a certain way. I think she wanted to break that stereotype by, again, signaling that she takes a backseat to no one. There's a reason why she, bonded such a close relationship with someone who I worked for in the past, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I worked for her presidential campaign. I know that she and Secretary Albright were incredibly close, and I imagine they dealt with a lot of the same, public expectations of women from that era. I'm sure that was a shared challenge that they both talked about, and was a part of their very public friendship and relationship.
And, Joel, as you point out, as she was the first female U.S. Secretary of State, she is undoubtedly a symbol for female empowerment for so many American women. How do you think politics, the landscape of politics, has changed for women since this trailblazing diplomat was in power?
Well, and I would always de-credential myself as not understanding what it's like to walk in Madeleine Albright's shoes as a woman in that position. I do know as someone from another historically underrepresented group as an African American, I will say that you are constantly making sure that you are proving yourself and proving your worth and your value in every room that you're in. And I'm certain that was a part of her walk. I think I imagine in her final days that she smiled at the idea of, that picture at the State of the Union where President Biden, you've got two people behind him, you've got Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Kamala Harris. I'd imagine that's the type of American future that she was working towards when she was in her heyday some quarter century ago. I imagine that is the future that she wanted for women coming up in the generation behind her.
Thank you so much for all of that. I believe we now have John Dickerson joining us as well. John, can you give us some insight into how Madeleine Albright's childhood experiences shaped her and shaped her political worldview?
Well, as a refugee, her father in Czechoslovakia was a supporter of democracy, and when the communists moved in, they were refugees, and she came to America, and that was one of her. When I talked to her a couple of years ago for a book I was writing on the presidency, she swerved out of her way to tell one of her favorite stories, which was that she used to participate in naturalization ceremonies. And one of the people that she helped become a U.S. citizen said, "Can you imagine a refugee as a U.S. citizen?" And she was at the time Secretary of State. And she said, "Can you imagine a Secretary of State who was a refugee?" She was incredibly proud of America's role in the world as a haven for refugees, and particularly in the moral battle with communism. And so she knew very well the history of Soviet aggression, and it's particularly poignant that she's passed at this period of time, which is very much like the period that she spent most of her working life working in, which is either in the Cold War or the post-Cold War period, thinking about Soviet aggression and thinking about the communist aggression that forced her from the place where she was born.
John, we've been talking here for the last many minutes about Madeleine Albright as trailblazer because, of course, a lot of people weren't sure at the time she sort of began to ascend that a woman could be successful in dealing with other foreign leaders. So how did she do it? How was Albright viewed by others, particularly her male counterparts?
Well, she did it by being tough and by knowing her brief, as they say. She knew what she was talking about. But I talked to her about this after she was out of office, and she said the struggle was constant because she was always in a room full of men as the only woman, and often, particularly when she was advocating for military action in Bosnia, she was advocating a position on the other side of generals. And she used to talk about, there's a famous confrontation with Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and she was calling for military action. And she said, why do we have this military? I'm paraphrasing. And he, in his biography, wrote that he almost had an aneurysm because he thought she was being too cavalier with the lives of service people. Her argument was that the U.S. has a moral role to play. And when you see evil attacking innocent people, the U.S. steps in. But she said in these confrontations with military officials, generals who have a chest full of medals, and she said, all I had was one little pin. And so she always, she talked about what it was like being taken seriously in a room full of men, and particularly in those instances where she was dealing with military officers, which is a challenge, as she pointed out, for anyone who hasn't served. To be able to have standing in those debates about when and where to use U.S. force.
And John, as we mentioned earlier, she was, she's recently once again talking about world events when she criticized Putin in an op-ed for the New York Times before he had invaded Ukraine, saying, should he do it, it will be a historic error. She came out very harshly against Vladimir Putin, talked a little bit about her impressions of him, which were none too flattering, to say the least. Can you tell us a little bit about her position on what's happening right now in the world? I mean, obviously, this is a time in which the world could use her viewpoint almost more than ever.
Well, if you think about U.S. foreign policy over the course of her lifetime, you had the U.S. essentially in rebuilding Europe in the post-Cold War, which she watched and benefited from, again, being welcomed as a refugee on the run from the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. So she saw the Cold War, grew up in and studied foreign policy during a time where basically the conversation was about capitalism versus communism, the United States versus the Soviet Union. Then she helped preside over foreign policy, not only during the Cold War in the Carter administration, but in the post-Cold War period in the Clinton administration, as America was trying to figure out its role in the world after the Soviet Union fell. Then we had the period of terrorism in American foreign policy. And now we are back at the moment into a period that looks much more like the post-Cold War or even the Cold War period that she was trained in and that she served in. And so she would have a lot to say, I think, on two fronts. One, America's moral obligation in the world. Two, she was a believer in the kinds of alliances and careful diplomacy that pays off in these moments. We've seen a lot of coverage about the West and how it's rallied against Vladimir Putin. Well, that doesn't happen by just adding water the day you need it. It requires the careful tending of alliances and a belief in obligations and commitments that America has to the world and that other nations have to freedom. And so she was a believer in the system that allows countries to come together and stand up against the kind of aggression we're seeing from Vladimir Putin. So she would have both a short-term, very clear-eyed view about Putin, but then also this longer-term perspective, which believed in committing to these long-term goals that are required if you're going to have a world in which dictators can't just go invading countries, or if they do, that in the end, history makes them pay a price for it.
You know, you make a very good point that NATO doesn't just blossom the day you need it to stand up. It takes that watering and tending that Madeleine Albright was so sure to provide. Well, John Dickerson, thank you so much. And Joel Payne, for your insights on this trailblazer. We appreciate it.
Thank you.